the United States and Ukraine have reached an agreement for the distribution of mineral revenue within Ukraine. But when you look at the actual text of the agreement, is it high on hope and light on details? Just what is missing from this agreement? Plus, what is Russia saying? Are they actually hardening their stance even further, shifting back away from any potential peace deal? And where does that leave the United States? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. Okay, so this is a honestly pretty crazy story. U.S. and Ukraine reach an agreement on minerals. And the fascinating thing is, again, this has been confirmed by President Zelensky's office. And the FT is reporting that Ukraine did secure more favorable terms during negotiations and is framing the deal as a way to strengthen ties with the United States. Again, Boris Johnson notably coming out in support of it, which is sort of unusual, but he's a notable figure in this in that he actually went to Ukraine at the outset of the war and said, listen, don't strike a deal with Russia or don't surrender, right? The deal Russia was putting on the table was surrender. Boris Johnson said, no, the Western powers will back you and you'll be able to maintain a level of sovereignty in your country. And almost all Ukrainians would agree that Boris Johnson's offer was very welcome and very accepted. As you may note, again, in this conflict, despite many of the anti-Ukraine ilk here in the U.S. will say, oh, they could have ended the war sooner. But you may note that that end of the war was being negotiated as Kiev was literally surrounded by Russian troops. And once Boris Johnson said, no, the West can help you, you saw Russian forces get driven back away from Kiev, literally running away back to Russia and focusing instead on primarily eastern Ukraine. So, when Boris Johnson came to the Ukrainians and said, listen, I think this is also a good deal, you should really look hard at taking it, it really resonated with them, is my suspicion, right? And I think the deal is not as bad as it could be, but nobody really knows, right? Now, what the deal is missing, of course, is security guarantees. This is something that Kiev insisted on, but the United States was like, listen, we can't promise you that for good reason, right? Because it would commit the United States to the quandary that the U.S. is in is that the United States is very clearly, for decades, been supporting Ukraine's sovereignty and its ability to stand up against Russian aggression. So when the U.S. wants to broker a peace deal, Russia says, no, we're not going to broker a peace deal with you because you are explicitly a supporter of the Ukrainian people. And so the U.S., again, has choices, but primarily, though, it's under Biden, at least, they said, listen, we are going to be a supporter of Ukraine. We are going to be their trainer in their corner, helping them, advising them. But ultimately, only the Ukrainians can sign a deal with Russia. And that may be one of the reasons that the Trump administration has been willing to suddenly become very friendly with Russia as a way of maybe trying to signal to Russia, hey, we are willing to be a neutral party here. But boy, they really managed to piss off literally everyone else in the process. And again, I don't actually think this is 5D chess because there were too many unforced errors. But a smarter person could leverage that to get a good deal. The problem is, of course, if you ink a deal that says the U.S. will back Ukrainian sovereignty, depending on exactly what that means, Russia may sit there and go, well, then there's no deal to be had. And again, as we're going to talk about, Russia may already be operating on that assumption. But here's what I really wanted to look at is the actual text of the deal. Now, I'm not going to read the whole thing to you because that's pretty tedious. And it starts with, of course, a preamble recognizing some realities. One of the ones I thought was interesting is that an acknowledgement that the U.S. desired to see a free, sovereign, and secure Ukraine, which is itself something that Russia says should not happen, that Ukraine shouldn't be a sovereign nation. Russia's official position is that Ukraine is historically Russian, and it's wrong and an aberration for Ukraine to be its own country, right? Ukrainians, of course, believe that Ukraine should be its own country, which is sort of a head-scratcher in its own right. But The other thing to take away that I thought was interesting, let's see if we can find it here. That United States and Ukraine recognize that the contribution that Ukraine has made to strengthening international peace and security by voluntarily abandoning the world's third largest arsenal of nuclear weapons. And that's, again, something that we all have to remember, that there is a standing treaty in force that says that Ukraine will have its sovereignty respected and enforced by the U.S. and Russia, and that was in exchange for giving up their nuclear weapons, something that I suspect most Ukrainians would now consider to be a regrettable decision. But having said that, right, this actual text of this treaty is pretty weird. It reads like a real estate deal, which makes sense given that the U.S. Treasury Secretary has negotiated 0 international agreements in his career, or at least agreements with nation states as parties. Instead, he is focused primarily on running a private hedge fund. So he likely has only at most limited agreements with maybe foreign headquartered companies. So it reads like it because, frankly, the negotiators have only ever done this kind of work. And so it contains a bunch of, I think, overly legalistic language that only would apply in U.S. courts. But because it's an agreement between the United States and Ukraine, it actually ends up in most other international treaties, they rely on very plain language because they have to get translated and maintain 100% of their meaning into 2 separate languages. And so they default to very plain, easy to understand languages or word choice. And of course, they are subject to 2 different sets of law. And so therefore, sophisticated wording that sometimes has like meaning within the United States legal system may not translate to, say, the Ukrainian legal system or a French legal system or a Canadian legal system. So the fact that this is so kind of flowery and legalese is itself kind of a sign of the lack of experience, I think, of U.S. negotiators. But what's also interesting is, again, there is really, really light discussion here. And there's a lot that is kicked, a lot of cans are kicked down the road through, let's see if we can find it. A subsequent fund agreement that, quote, is to be negotiated promptly after the conclusion of this bilateral agreement, right? And again, it is effectively saying, right, that this is the creation of a Reconstruction investment fund and partnering in the fund through joint ownership, right, further defined in a fund agreement. So it's going to be joint owned by the U.S. and Ukraine as participants, but it does not specify who owns what percentage. It simply says the maximum percentage of ownership of the fund's equity and financial interests is to be held by the government of the United States of America, and the decision-making authority of the representatives of the governments of the United States of America will be to the extent permissible under applicable U.S. laws. Now, again, what exactly is the maximum percentage of ownership, right? Does that mean that the U.S. has decision-making authority over the fund, or is it joint decision-making authority? Well, the rest of the treaty seems to indicate that it is joint, right? Both Ukraine and the U.S. have to agree for the fund to make an investment. And that's what it is. It says, listen, Ukraine's going to collect additional revenues beyond what it currently collects. It's going to contribute them to a reconstruction fund, and then the U.S. and Ukraine will agree on how the fund will be distributed or invested in the reconstruction efforts for Ukraine. But what's also interesting is they say, listen, the fund can also pay the government of Ukraine back when it makes investments in, for example, again, minerals, hydrocarbons, natural gas, and other extractable materials, and other infrastructure relevant to natural resource assets. So this is, again, as agreed by both participants. So, effectively, this is giving the U.S. a veto power over Ukrainian financial decisions around investment in natural materials extraction, which, again, is something that, and the conclusion of the war definitely is going to need to happen. Now, the only part of this deal that sucks, the fundamental part that sucks for Ukraine is that the U.S. isn't going to put any funds in. It's just going to have an ownership stake of funds that Ukraine puts into the money that Ukraine puts into the fund, right? But it's required to be reinvested in Ukraine annually, which, as we've talked about in this channel ad nauseum is actually the primary vehicle where the U.S. stands to make money for Ukraine. This is a written version, in some ways, of what is a de facto reality of entering kind of the Western economic universe. And what I mean by that is that at the end of the day, if Ukraine, Ukraine emerges victorious and sovereign with the U.S. support. Let's say you had a victory in the context of like a Democratic, like a Biden-Harris type presidency, right? Instead of Trump. Well, Ukraine emerges victorious. There is no official agreement, but it's implied that Ukraine signs some kind of trade deal with either the EU, the United States, enters kind of that Western trade bloc, and possibly receives either NATO membership explicitly or a NATO-grade security guarantee, right? Well, what's going to happen there? Again, basically the same thing. Ukraine, under the assistance of the West, is going to definitely take its government revenues that it receives from mineral extraction, and the West is going to encourage them to reinvest it in more infrastructure, right? And the West says, listen, you can go to a bank or the IMF, and we promise we'll buy your minerals or hydrocarbons so you can go and get a loan because you're going to have these future revenues guaranteed. And your government then can take that loan and develop infrastructure to help mine and extract, right? This is a playbook that is used in almost all post-Soviet countries, and this becomes a virtuous cycle of development. And it's implied, right, that in the event of hostilities, that the other countries are not going to do business with a hostile actor or someone that the Western community of nations agrees is hostile. And we're seeing that right now with Russia. Look how many European countries are respecting sanctions against the Russian economy. Now, not all of them, as we've talked about, particularly German-speaking countries like Austria and Germany, they continue to buy Russian natural gas piped in over pipelines. But by and large, this kind of informal consensus doesn't require a treaty to specify it. Now, there are big gaps in this treaty that are left to this fund agreement. And the fund agreement is what's going to answer the real problems here, right? The real issues. And the number one is that who gets to make decisions, who gets veto power, and how is this fund allocated? And all of those things are deferred to the fund agreement. In drafting the fund agreements, participants will strive to avoid conflicts with Ukraine's obligation under its accession to the European Union, something that is, again, the European Union has expressly committed to have Ukraine join the EU, and other arrangements with other financial institutions. The fund will provide inter alia an acknowledgement. Again, this is like a U.S. legal term that has, I suspect, no meaning in Ukrainian legalese, and probably doesn't even translate to Ukrainian, if we're honest. It's not an English term, it's a Latin term. Right? And of course, the fund agreement has to still be ratified. So this isn't even really in effect because it has to be ratified by both Ukraine and the United States, right? And they just say, oh yeah, the fund agreement should totally pay attention to the control mechanism. The text of the fund agreement is going to be developed by these working groups. The bilateral agreement and the fund agreement will constitute integral elements of the architecture of these agreements. But you see here, man, wow, the fund agreement is doing a lot of the heavy lifting, telling us what exactly this entails. Again, the only thing the treaty says is the U.S. basically gets a veto power over Ukraine's investment decisions, which again is something that is not that different from the previous reality, the pre-invasion reality. You might note that, again, the U.S. basically had this agreement by saying, hey, we provide a lot of aid to you Ukrainians. So in exchange, we need you to reduce the level of corruption. So if you try to sign these big deals with Russian oligarchs or deals that are blatantly corrupt, we, the United States, reserve the right to step in and say, hey, if we don't want to see, again, this Russian oligarch own, buy Ukrainian government roadways or toll roads or a mining operation for peanuts. This is corruption, and you're going to stop it, or else we're going to pull our money. So this isn't actually all that different, right? pending, of course, the fact that there's holes in it big enough to drive a truck through, and they are all allegedly going to be answered by the funding agreement, which will totally be negotiated later. So there's also, of course, one other little detail that I actually think is pretty important to point out, and that is at the very bottom, where the U.S. government supports Ukraine's efforts to obtain security guarantees and the need to establish lasting peace. Participants will speak to identify any necessary steps to protect mutual investments as defined in the fund agreement. Right? It's binding. There's one other allusion, I think, to hostile parties. Right? Let's see if I can find it here. It's not hostile. It's maybe aggressive. Nope. There is an allusion about that is actually fairly explicit about Ukraine's like enemies, right? Which is close, but not quite. Right? Oh yeah, the United States of America and Ukraine wish to ensure that those states and other persons that have acted adversely to Ukraine, which is, man, that is a real. The word adversely is really carrying a lot of weight, given the fact that adverse actions include like war crimes to Ukraine in this conflict do not benefit from the reconstruction of Ukraine following a lasting peace. Again, the other thing to remember in this kind of deal is that ultimately, international agreements do not have international courts, right? So there is, just like if you were to sign an agreement, let's say with a contractor who's going to redo your kitchen, and you think that contractor hasn't honored what's in the contract, you would take him to court. There is no international court, FYI, right? Not for major conflicts like this. Just, you're going to say, oh, there's an international criminal court. Well, the International Criminal Court has said that Putin and Netanyahu and hundreds of other people, thousands potentially of other people, are totally criminals and will totally be arrested, and they are absolutely not arrested. Nobody does anything. It is a performance, right? The International Criminal Court is a performance in almost all cases. Again, even when they are sentenced, when criminals are sentenced, they're basically just sentenced under Dutch law, and they're usually just indefensibly bad war criminals. So I think the big takeaway is that these agreements are not necessarily worth even the paper they're printed on. And as we point out, that if Congress fails to ratify this or the Ukrainian parliament fails to ratify this, then it goes right into the paper shredder. So there's a lot of holes in the agreement, but nonetheless, Trump really just wants to take a victory lap. Now, before we talk about what Ukraine is up to and why Russia seems to be hardening its stance, not becoming more conciliatory, I want to mention, of course, that one of the reasons I can be so critical of everybody, and I mean literally everybody in this conflict, is that except for the only people, I even sometimes criticize the Ukrainian military, but usually they're higher commands. I have very few notes for the average Ukrainian fighting soldier because, frankly, it's not my war to fight, and they seem to be doing an excellent job. So, but the reason I can basically criticize everyone else is because you guys have my back over on combatvetnews.com. This is like my version of Patreon. Every Tuesday and Thursday, I get uncensored combat videos, oftentimes videos sent to me by soldiers on the front lines currently fighting. And we do a deep dive analysis, gives us the best insight into the state of the war today. Plus, there's an AMA every week. And if you want to support me, you can get any one of these tiers. Help me out. I appreciate all of you guys that do. The link is in the description. Okay. So I want to point out a couple of things that I think are interesting trends. The first, that Ukrainian defense forces have lately been giving as well as they've gotten. You could see that for literally like 6 to 8 weeks, really for the last 6 to 8 months, I would say, you almost never saw Ukrainian forces counterattack. They were looking to preserve their personnel and combat power. And they were looking to basically fight on the back foot, drawing Russian forces out, inflicting maximal Russian casualties. And now we're seeing something interesting. We're seeing more and more small, localized counterattacks. You see the Ukrainian forces rolling Russia back near Kotlina. And we've talked about this actually as part of a larger strategy to sort of pressure Russian forces in this pincer movement and then cook these guys in Kotlina. So it makes sense that Russia creates this salient and Ukraine is going to try to tourniquet them, and then amputate the Russian parts of the Russian army here, and trying to encircle Pokrovsk. Right, you could see this is part of a larger effort to sort of get Pokrovsk more breathing room. But the real fascinating part is, again, that you're seeing in several different places where Ukrainian forces are, again, conducting some of these operations in which they appear able to, again, conduct just localized kind of counterattacks. It doesn't mean that Russia isn't also advancing, but they're advancing at a much slower rate than we've seen historically, and they are advancing only where they can sort of grab little pieces of this and that, right? Like, observe here, this area that Russia recently seized. It's basically 2 tree lines and across a river. It's not really on the road to anything. It might be part of a campaign to maybe encircle this little Preobrazhenska. But, you could see this isn't really on the road to anywhere. In fact, this road just kind of peters off in a tree line here. So you're seeing Russia increasingly operate this way, right? And there's even rumors that in Toretsk, some Ukrainian forces have pushed the Russians back recently, but this has been unconfirmed. But you're just seeing in general, I think, a slowing of the Russian war machine. And I think it's a sign for Russia that their recruitment is down, that they have just fewer bodies willing to sign up to engage in this kind of war effort, right? Because ultimately, Russia isn't relying on a draft. They're relying on contract soldiers who are willing to sign on to these kind of operations. And the fact is the bonuses are getting higher and higher and higher, but there's more and more reports of, for example, Russia coercing contracted soldiers to sign extensions of their agreements. And that's not something that they've had to do in the last year. So again, all of these are an indicator that Russia may be losing its most valuable and scarcest resource, which is combat-capable soldiers. And that's, as we talked about, a pretty low bar, but it's something that Russia is really trying to offset. And that might be one of the reasons why Ukraine is pushing into the Russian military, because what they don't want to do is have the Russian military stop its offensive operations, pivot to the defense, and then allow that trickle of recruits to plus its units back up, and then it resumes a massive push towards places like Pokrovsk. So what I thought was also interesting, though, is Russia, again, as the U.S. has started to become more amenable, this is a nice way of putting it, to Russian really propaganda, Russia itself has begun to harden its stances, right? Because Russia says, well, we're winning. The United States and Europe have never been more disunited. Ukraine has never been more politically isolated. Why on earth would we start to compromise now? They say, listen, there's going to be no ceasefire along the contact lines. We will be capturing all 4 Ukrainian regions. There is no ceasefire, right? Lavrov, this is a quote from him. He says, some say, okay, let's leave the line of contact. This is Russian and this is Ukrainian. Lavrov says, this will not happen. We, the Russians, have a constitution based on the will of the people. That's bold. Lavrov said at a press conference referring to Moscow's illegal referendums within Ukraine, where, again, Russia announced the annexation of Ukraine's Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhzhia regions after holding what it called referendums in the occupied areas. Now, I want to point out that these referendums, by definition, could not have been legal. Why? Well, notice Lavrov's chain of logic. Even if you have no other information, the Russians held these referendums in 2022. And as of 2022, let's see if we can zip ourselves back here, right? We'll say that they happened in December, right? So let's say December 31st, 2022. Now, as you can see here, Russian forces, right, were quite a bit further back. Not a ton, you can see, but basically, things looked much like they do now, except for the fact that Bakhmut still stood. But this is where Russian-occupied territories, this is where they held their referendums. Now, even if you ignore the fact that there was some pretty blatant ballot stuffing and that you can't really have a referendum while armed soldiers stand and watch you vote, right? It's pretty obvious. You don't really need much more information as a voter to tell you how to vote when you have armed guards watching you. And so Russia said, yeah, these regions all voted to be annexed. But here's the problem. Let's say you conducted that vote right on December 31st, 2022. Well, why then would Russia feel the need to continue to seize towns like Bakhmut, or Ivanevsky, Chasiv Yar, right? Why does Russia feel that they have the will of the people has told them that they need to take these entire regions when by definition, the people outside of occupied Ukraine didn't vote? So you see, this is just Lavrov. He's not even trying anymore, right? He's like, so we totally asked the Ukrainians who we've occupied and instituted a military control, and they told us that they definitely want us to keep going and conquer their neighbors. And because the will of the people is tantamount in the Russian constitution, we're going to conquer those people who never got a chance to vote. So he's not even like trying at this point, right? And at present, Russia, of course, controls the majority of Luhansk and nearly the entirety of Luhansk region and the majority of the Donetsk region. Again, Lavrov rejected Western troop deployments to Ukraine as part of security guarantees and called for the so-called root cause of the invasion to be addressed, right? Again, what he says, notice what he says to the Russian people about the root causes. He says, quote, there are people who remain there who find it more convenient to speak Russian, who want to preserve the traditions of their ancestors, who are brought up in Russian culture. Therefore, such simple mechanical things as the deployment of foreign troops will not do. We need to talk about the root causes. So again, where's I thought they were fighting NATO, right? What happened to resisting NATO aggression? What happened to, Ukrainian biolabs, right? None of those things are even true, even to the Russian propagandists. They don't think they're true, right? Russian propagandists say the same thing. They say, listen, these lands are meant to be Russian. They're meant to be Russian. They're historically Russian lands. It is a historical wrong that we must right. You're going to join your ancestors, whether you like it or not, Ukrainians, right? A really brilliant take by Lavrov. So again, point this stuff out. When you hear somebody who's like, oh, well, it's NATO. Oh, maybe if NATO wasn't encircling Russia. One, you can always counter that point with two things. The actual statements of Vladimir Putin and Lavrov, which you just saw. And two, a fucking map. Because you may note that the Russian map, they are not encircled by NATO. And in 2022 or 2021, before the invasion, they're even less encircled by NATO because countries like Finland were not NATO members. So if NATO encirclement was the cause of the war, right? And now Russia's even more encircled by NATO. Well, why hasn't Russia invaded Finland? So it's obviously bullshit, right? And speaking of things that are obviously bullshit, I got to point out one other thing that I find deeply problematic, right? And, again, I have had real criticisms of Elon Musk's so-called audit of the federal government. He's doing just an absolutely terrible job. It was really, if he was a day one auditor, he would be fucking fired for being so terrible. But he and I are actually in agreement that the federal spending is out of control and must be reined in because it will result in really dire fiscal problems for the United States. And so I maintain hope that for all of his total fuck-ups, he will at least leverage his role in government to ensure that there's increasing fiscal responsibility. But the House of Representatives just passed their first draft of their budget, really the first budget for the Trump administration. And buckle up, nerds, because we are going deeper into debt, baby. This is like sitting there and looking and being like, I notice that in our grocery bill, we bought some like stuff for our neighbors, right? Our neighbors, we bought a birthday cake for their kids, and we spent too much on like snack foods, right? We bought some Lay's. Think of this isn't right. This isn't right. And then, of course, it's Elon, so he would also make shit up. He'd be like, well, I saw on the receipt, it said that you bought something called an Acme. And they're like, no, dude, Acme is actually the name of the grocery store, but I see where your confusion is, Or he's like, you bought Total. Look, right? If this was Elon Musk auditing your grocery bill, he'd be like, look, you bought Total cereal and you spent $400 on it. And you'd be like, no, dude, Total is, that's all the other expenses added up. But the Elon cuts are like, you're going through your bill and you're line iteming out everything, little thing. And then while you're at the trip to the grocery store, right, with your new fiscal discipline, you stop on your way back and buy a fucking boat. Okay? That is the level of recklessness that we're seeing right now. A $2.8 trillion deficit increase. Guys, for the record, for those of you keeping track at home, the value of every single piece of economic activity in the entire United States is about $30 trillion. So this isn't going to be the new deficit. We are adding 10% of the entire value of the goods and services of the United States to the deficit, despite these so-called cuts. And it's because, just like balancing a budget, it's like sitting there and you have to increase your revenue and reduce your expenses. You have to do both, or at least keep revenue neutral. But instead, this budget has a massive tax cut that primarily benefits the wealthiest taxpayers. But whether or not you think that's a valid economic policy, it's not conducive to also balancing the budget. It's actually making the problem worse. And so this is literally described by, again, this is nonpartisan, and they actually are nonpartisan. A committee for a responsible federal budget describes it as unfathomable that we already have multi-trillion-dollar deficits, debts climbing toward record highs, lawmakers' response to pass a budget, allowing themselves to add trillions more in debt over the next decade. It should never even have been entertained. So, things aren't shaping up for a great time for the United States. Yeah, this is not great. Remember, guys, just for context, you should remember that the federal budget chart, let's see if we can find it here. Buckle up. Let's see. 2016. No, we got to find 2020, 2024, baby. Let's see. Join this. Join me, if you will. Composition of the proposed budget. Here we go. Oh my God. God help me. Okay. For 2024, right? Interest on the debt. We're going to pay nearly $1 trillion in interest alone, right? There's defense spending, right? Other discretionary spending, about $1 trillion. Defense spending, a little less than $1 trillion. And then we have all the mandatory stuff. Social Security, legally required. Medicare, legally required. Medicaid, legally required. And other mandatory. This is things like VA healthcare, 13 and nearly $1 trillion. So you notice that this interest on the debt, guys, is as large, nearly as large as we spend as much on Medicare and more than Medicaid, just paying the interest on our credit card. So something to think about. Anyway, guys, that's all I had. Thank you to James Sterling, Steve Moran, Doug Beck, Alan Knutson, Bastian Himmeling, Brian Kelly, Dale McCombs, Jay Zelwa, Henry Roussier. All of our Lieutenant tier members couldn't do it without you guys. Hit that subscribe button and join me over on combatvetnews.com. I'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers.